Just what is it that we find so fascinating about wrecks? Here in the Red Sea, there's certainly no shortage of wrecks. From perhaps the most famous of all, the giant British military ship, the Thistlegorm, to the countless tugs and sailing boats that have come to grief here over the centuries. Take the Thistlegorm, a big, important ship bombed during the Second World War. Further south, the Salem Express, a large Egyptian ferry which sank with terrible human consequences. Then we've got a whole host of other vessels that have fallen victim to the maze of coral reefs. But the one thing they all have in common is that they've all been claimed by the sea, and they've all become part of this rich underwater environment that makes the Red Sea so special. Of all the wrecks in the Red Sea, without doubt the most famous is the Thistlegorm. She was sunk in a nighttime raid in 1941 by German bombers. Then in the 1950s, the great master himself, Jacques Cousteau, discovered the wreck thanks to the knowledge of local fishermen. Today, she's a giant undersea museum crammed full of military hardware, and she attracts armies of divers from all over the world. Not surprisingly, the popularity of the Thistlegorm means the dive site is often crowded with boats. Dozens regularly tie up over the spot where she lies, the larger liverboards and the dayboats all vying for position.
We are moored with our bow line is moored to the bridge area, yeah, the port side bridge area. So the wreck, if you could see maybe some saw from the top, you can see it, yeah. So our bow line is by the bridge, and that's why we were seeing the funnel area and this corrugated metal area. If you look, like this, like a piece of corrugated metal. This is the former deck that was up here when there was the explosion. It went back. So
the more experienced dive guides know the story of the Thistlegorm well.
For many years, British ships going up and down the Suez Canal were still taking their hats off and making. Paying their honors to in this area when they were passing. This wreck was transporting all kinds of war material, as I said this morning, up to the troops of the British troops in North Africa. So you will
Today, conditions just north of Shag Rock are ideal, though such is the huge attraction of this World War II wreck. She's dived all year round, almost regardless of weather. Like diving in a sea of lemonade, the Thistlegorm is often shrouded in a constant stream of bubbles. She is, after all, one of the great wrecks of the world. It's easy to see why. Not only is the Thistlegorm bedecked with a fascinating array of historical artefacts, she's also upright and rests in just over 30 meters of water. Our journey around and inside this famous war freighter involves more than a dozen dives in varying conditions. There's always more to see, more to investigate. In the sky blue waters of a November morning, the Thistlegorm shows off her massive frame, from the section where she was bombed, moving past the bridge area and over the cargo holds, before finally settling near hold number 1. It's in these holds that the great ship houses some of her greatest attractions. where divers are drawn like magnets to marvel at the vast supplies which had been bound for the British 8th Army in North Africa in the early years of the Second World War. Built in Sunderland in 1940, this 5,000-ton steam-driven cargo ship was launched just a year before her fate would be sealed by German bombers. She was built for the Albin Line as one of a number of ships in her class. This is the only known photograph of the Thistlegorm afloat. Her 5 holds were able to carry vast quantities of supplies, so as soon as she was completed, she was requisitioned for use by the British government to help in the war effort. But her protection would be limited to a modest level of firepower. Today it's easy to navigate around her bulk, the scars of battle all too apparent. The torn and twisted metal peeled away behind the funnel area is a clear indication of the devastating force of the explosions that ripped the Thistlegorm in two. As a wreck dive, she's basically divided into two. The more interesting bow section housing the many World War II vehicles for which the Thistlegorm is renowned. Forward of the funnel are the holds which contain the Bedford trucks and dozens of BSA motorcycles. Either side of hold number 4 are the 2 distinctive railway water tenders. The bow remains upright in fairly good condition, while the more damaged stern is inclined at an angle. Her large propeller has also withstood the test of time. Dropping down onto the stern section is a wreck diver's dream, especially when the visibility's this good. When the pioneering Jacques Cousteau first laid eyes on the Thistlegorm in the early 1950s, he must have marvelled at the sheer scale of discovery and sense of history. Cousteau would have also enjoyed the privilege of seeing the wreck almost undisturbed since the war. His team was the first to see the evidence of how, on a clear night in 1941, amid rumours that the troop ship the Queen Mary was in the vicinity, German bombers instead found the Thistlegorm. She was a sitting duck. The German fighter pilots dropped 2 bombs, which struck hold number 5 with tragic consequences. Nine men lost their lives in the attack, which caused massive explosions, which in turn lit up the sky, giving away the location of another British vessel, the Rosalie Muller. She would suffer exactly the same fate, exactly 48 hours later. Cousteau kept the location of the Thistlegorm a secret, and here she would lie in relative obscurity for many years to come. In this time, the wreck became a haven for marine life, providing a platform for soft and hard corals, shelter for smaller creatures, and an obvious food source for larger fish, like the big schools of barracuda that swirl around the Thistlegorm, or the hungry jacks that patrol her decks in search of prey. It wasn't until the early 1990s that one of the Red Sea's greatest secrets was uncovered for the second time. Now this giant casualty of war is on show for all to see. Rising up over the bow, this part of the wreck with her bulky anchor chains remains remarkably intact. But it's deep inside the holds that we find her valuable cargo of war merchandise trapped in time. Row upon row of BSA motorcycles, gradually being eaten away by rust, which is caked on almost every square inch of metal. Unfortunately, some divers have been unable to resist either vandalising these underwater museum exhibits or plundering them for souvenirs, basically anything small enough to remove as a trophy of their dive. To save space, many of the motorcycles had been stored inside the equally important consignment of Bedford trucks. These World War II trucks, including about a dozen Matador lorries as well as the cars, have hardly shifted since being loaded in Glasgow all those years ago. They'd had to come the long way round via the African Cape because the Suez Canal was closed. And so the Thistlegorm ended up at the bottom of the sea, just a few hundred miles from her destination with the 8th Army at Tobruk. In another hold, the vast supplies of weaponry and ammunition include Lee Enfield rifles, which had been packed in boxes of 10, now revealed end to end after their casings rotted away. But the coloration of the trucks full of Wellington boots has diminished little over the decades. And if you're wondering why Wellington boots were needed in the desert, it's because in the rainy season it can get pretty muddy. SS Thistlegorm's maximum depth of 30 metres or so makes her an ideal dive site. On the seabed, just a short distance from the wreck, lies one of the locomotives that was blasted off the deck by the force of the explosions. Moving further south, the shattered remains of the stern section, on which the Thistlegorm, travelling as an armed freighter, had only a single high-caliber 4.7-inch machine gun to defend herself. On the night of the disaster, it would have proved no use whatsoever. The ship's large propeller sits proudly on the seabed, barely affected by the passage of time, which, with every year, sees the reputation of this mighty vessel grow in stature because of the increasing popularity of diving. With the main deck at a much shallower 18 metres or so, providing the current's not running too fast, there's plenty more to enjoy towards the end of the dive. Despite the extensive damage around the bridge, it's possible to gain easy access to the cabin of Captain William Ellis, who was one of the survivors picked up by a Royal Navy support vessel. It's easy to understand why the Thistlegorm now holds a special place within the diving world. She has all the trappings of a bygone era whose story continues to touch our deep-rooted sense of adventure and discovery. So to the Rosalie Muller, another British casualty of the Second World War. She's also got a remarkable history behind her. Just 2 days after the Thistlegorm was hit, the same convoy of German aircraft dropped 2 bombs on the Rosalie Muller, and it was here in the Gobal Strait that she sank on that terrible night in 1941. But more than half a century would pass before the Red Sea would give up another of her great secrets. When the Rosalie Muller was travelling north towards the Gulf of Suez, she was carrying the much less glamorous consignment of coal. Like the Thistlegorm, she too had travelled the long journey around the Cape and was waiting at anchor for further instructions. It's a journey which is far less treacherous for today's skippers, despite the hazardous network of coral reef systems near to Gubal Island. Modern-day navigation also makes finding the wreck sites fairly easy. It's now possible with depth sounders and GPS satellite positioning to pinpoint exactly where on the wreck to drop anchor. These days, most of the boat crews, particularly on liveaboards, know the big dive sites like the back of their hand. As she's so close to the Thistlegorm, it's hardly surprising that the Rosalie Muller has very quickly become an important dive site, especially with the growing demand for intense wreck diving itineraries. This is a deep dive by recreational standards. So when the Rosalie Muller gradually comes into focus in the often milky waters of this channel, it's dangerous to ignore the limits of time. Despite the poor visibility, or at least poor by Red Sea standards, first glimpses reveal a massive ship which would be impossible to navigate in a single dive. At just under 110 metres, she's slightly shorter than the mighty Thistlegorm. Dropping down past the lifeboat davits near the stern and the living quarters, her deck at an even 25 metres is a tangle of winches and crane gear. One of the most striking things about the Rosalie Muller is the sheer numbers of glassfish that swarm around almost every square inch of the wreck, from bow to stern, whether exposed or within the more confined spaces of her walkways and cargo holds. For the hordes of predators, the wreck must seem like a fast food restaurant, and all the usual suspects seem to be here, including the highly efficient jackfish. There's also a healthy population of lionfish to be found on the prowl. A large grouper is among the many new deckhands manning their stations. Despite her depth, the Rosalie Muller sits on the seabed at almost exactly 50 metres, there's still a degree of coral growth, both soft and hard. When she was launched in Glasgow in 1910, she set sail under the name of the Francis. She acquired the new name when she was later sold to the Muller Line Shipping Company. Inevitably, though, as war loomed, the Rosalie Muller became a valuable addition to the Royal Navy's transportation fleet, carrying vital supplies of coal. Only since her relatively recent discovery have divers been able to see for themselves how she became such an easy casualty of German bombers. Moving past the swirling masses of fish on the starboard side, there's a gaping hole in the ship's hull, where the two bombs have cut her open like a can opener. Totally defenceless, it was under cover of darkness on October the 8th, 1941, that she was hit shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning. She sank less than an hour later with the loss of 2 lives. Today, the Rosalie Muller is a distinguished companion of the Thistlegorm. Likewise, she's sitting upright on the seabed, albeit in a much better condition than her fellow war victim. Her masts are still vertical, and much of her rigging, winches and other deck features remain in remarkably good condition. Despite the magnitude of the blast, the ship's funnel had barely shifted. Until, that is, it was pulled over, most likely by the anchor of a dive boat. Forward of the funnel, which has the distinctive large M signature of the Muller Line still visible for all to see, is a largely intact bridge. But it's towards the stern that we see the scars of battle, the peeled back hull where one of the bombs struck the hold, containing her cargo of Welsh coal. It was almost the end of the millennium by the time divers started to get excited about the discovery of this remarkable World War II wreck. But such is the competitive nature within certain elements of the diving industry that arguments about who actually found her first wrangle on. As is so often the case, some relics of the ship's working life have been removed. Thankfully, not everything has vanished. Deep inside the Rosalie Muller, well below 40 meters, there's just enough time to